Okay, I think we have the majority of people joining us who are going to join us online now. So we'll get started today. Just a little bit of housekeeping from me. I'm Ali, part of the online safety team here at Ofcom, and thanks for joining our transparency webinar. This is the third series in our online safety sort of sequence of webinars. If you would like to look back at our illegal harms webinars or protection of children webinars, we can provide links to those. We can send those out to you, but hopefully many of you will have already joined. I would really encourage everyone to ask any questions they may have today via the Q&A feature here in Teams. You can submit your question to us, and you can also uprate via thumbs up other people's questions. That's helpful to us, just so we can see which are most popular and which we should prioritize as we go through. We've got about 30 or 40 minutes for our presentation on our transparency consultation, and then we'll try and allow the rest of the time for Q&A. As you might expect, we can answer anything about our consultation, what we've published so far, and hopefully provide some clarity. There might be things we need to avoid giving specific advice, getting into the specifics of who might be categorized or what metrics may form part of this regime, but we'll explain the context of all of that as we run through today. So just to flag that this will be recorded, and we can share the link after. If you need to share this with colleagues or your network, please do so. And we'll be asking for your feedback on this session at the end as well. So I think that's everything. I'll see you again for the Q&A, and I'll hand over to our Policy Development Director, Jess Zucker, to introduce things today.
Thanks, Ali. Hi, everyone. I'm Jess Zucker. I'm one of the directors in the online safety group. And as Ali mentioned, we're all here today to talk to you about our transparency guidance consultation, which we published at the end of July. And this sets out our approach for how we're planning on making some really important decisions about the kinds of information that Ofcom will require platforms to publish in their transparency reports as part of the duties under the Online Safety Act. As Ali mentioned, this follows on subsequent publications in different parts of our Online Safety Act implementation, including those on illegal harms duties, as well as child protection, and more recently on enforcement and information gathering. Transparency fits within our sort of third phase of regulation, and this is targeted on the additional duties that categorized services will need to put in place. What we'll focus on today in the webinar is how we'll go about making decisions about the information that will require platforms to publish, how we will engage with services during the reporting cycle, as well as how we will go about publishing our own transparency reports. I think transparency reporting is a really important part of the Online Safety Act and the way that we plan on helping achieve our mission of keeping users safer online in the UK. And we think through transparency reporting, which we'll speak about later today, is really we'll be able to shine a light on services in terms of the kinds of systems that they have to improve user safety, as well as really a way for us to empower the public to make more informed choices about the information that they need about services that they use. We also think that transparency reporting will help to encourage services themselves to make improvements to safety as well as their governance practices. And this transparency reporting and the information that we'll be publishing, I think, will really serve a really wide range of audiences, from users to researchers to civil society groups, advertisers, investors, shareholders, journalists, you name it. So a huge range of different use cases, all of which we think will be really useful in helping us achieve our mission. We're really excited to get to work on this very important part of the online safety regime. We'll speak in a lot more detail throughout the course of the next hour. And I want to thank you all for participating in this webinar today. So I will stop there and hand over to Andrew Park, who's going to be kicking off our presentation.
Thanks very much, Jess. And hello to everybody. My name is Andrew Park. I head up the strategy and stakeholder engagement team. Can we just go back one slide, Remedy? Thank you. So I'm conscious quite a few people will have seen some of these slides quite a few times, but for those of you who are new to this, important to provide a little bit of context. So I'll give a quick explanation on the Online Safety Act, our approach to implementing it, and then try and provide a bit of frame of reference for how the transparency reporting fits into all of this. So as hopefully all of you know, the Act passed last year. Its focus is upon building a safer life online for people in the UK. Ofcom, as the nominated regulator, has a key role to play in implementing this. The focus for us in line with the Act is to ensure that services have the necessary systems and processes in place to both assess risks and then ensure that appropriate mitigations are put in place to address harms to users. We have a number of different levers that are tied to the Act that we have to bring about that change. So the kind of key four that we talk about, the first is around establishing standards. So that's us publishing our codes and guidance that set out how services, regulated services, can comply with the duties. The second is about driving industry improvements. So we've set up and established a supervisory team that works closely, particularly with the largest and riskiest services, to ensure they're clear about how they go about complying with their duties. And we'll be working closely with them in the coming years. Third key lever is around assuring compliance. So we've got a well-established enforcement function that already sits within Ofcom, and where we see services not take appropriate steps to address harms, we will of course look to use the various powers that we have under the Act. And then finally, and this is where kind of transparency is one of the key levers in all of this, it's about holding services to account. So transparency reporting will be one of the key sort of elements in this. Can we just move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the Act, as many of you know, is very broad and very deep to ensure that we've got a kind of clear focus in the coming years to ensure that we realise our ambition of making life safer online for people across the UK. We've got 4 clear strategic objectives, and they focus on governance and risk management. So we want to ensure that all services, all regulated services, have in place appropriate governance and accountability arrangements, so they're assessing risk and making sure that across the business steps are being taken to address those risks of harm, particularly to children. We want to ensure that that is operationalized. So safety by design is very much at the heart of the way that the Act is designed and the approach that we're taking to implementing it. So we would expect services day to day to be taking steps to ensure that particular mitigations are put in place to address those harms that have been identified. The third element is around user empowerment and choice. So a lot of users probably aren't aware of the level of choice they have about the type of content that they're served, who they can actually interact with and who can interact with them, and the steps that they can take where if things do go wrong, what can they do to actually report that the harm that's arisen, and also expect that something is done to sort of address those harms. And then finally, underpinning all of this is a focus upon transparency and trust. And again, I come back to transparency. We think that's got a really important role, as Jess was saying, in shining a light on what services are or are not doing. And that's a fundamental to us starting to build trust, both in the online safety regime and its ability to sort of elicit the change we want to see, but more broadly, the steps that services are taking and Ofcom's role as the regulator in ensuring that that's appropriately enforced. Can we go to the next slide, please? So they're the sort of our long-term high-level strategic aims and objectives. Over the next 3 or 4 years, we've got a really clear set of goals that we're aiming to achieve. So this is about us translating those high-level objectives into sort of tangible impact that we want to see. At the heart of all of this is governance. So across all types of harm that services may identify as they start to go through their risk assessments, we expect user safety to be very much at the heart of the way that they think about those harms, that they're ensuring they've got appropriate measures in place to tackle them, and ultimately that there are people at senior level accountable for ensuring that steps are taken right across the piece. So that was absolutely kind of the cornerstone of the approach that we're taking. And then more specifically, we would expect a number of key changes to be visible day to day from users on these services as well. So we would expect children to be protected from harmful online content, particularly pornography. It should be far harder for them to access that. It should be far harder for offenders to share child sexual abuse, but also to make unsafe contact with children. Where services identify illegal content, including hate and terror, that is taken down swiftly. We would expect women and girls to face far less gendered harm than unfortunately they currently experience. We would expect, given its prevalence, online fraud to start to reduce as well. And then across the piece, we'd expect all users, particularly children, finding it far more readily accessible to report harmful content to platforms, and for them to expect those platforms to take steps to address that. And underlying all of this, and one of the kind of key elements of us ensuring this is happening, will be the transparency elements of the regime, including the transparency reporting that we're going to be talking about today. And that's absolutely sort of fundamental to shining a light on whether services are meeting these objectives that we're setting. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Ramneet? Thank you very much. So in terms of where we are, in terms of the implementation itself, the Act passed last year, and we rapidly published our illegal harms consultation. That has now kind of gone through the consultation process, and we are still on track later this year to publish our statement, a legal harms statement, which will bring the codes into force early next year. The second phase of work is focused on the child safety duties and requirements, a duty around pornography, particularly for porn providers. That consultation on protected children closed recently, and we're working through those consultation responses. We are still expecting to publish our statement next year, early next year, so we're on track for that as well. And then the final phase of work focuses upon duties for categorized services. So as Jess mentioned before, for specific services where they have a particularly high reach within the UK or a particular high risk profile, there are additional duties that apply to those services. This consultation is the first step in that sort of consultation process. We'll be working through at the moment. The election has created some questions around some of the timing for this. There are elements of parliamentary process that we need to go through in terms of categorisation thresholds that we'll need to go through. So we're working with government on that at the moment. We are still looking to publish a consultation on the categorised service codes next year as well, and we'll be updating in the autumn on what that looks like in terms of our roadmap. And on to the final slide, please, Ramneet. So just to bring it, just as a sort of brief reminder on the categorised services, there are a range of additional duties, as I mentioned, that will apply to categorised services. A key element of the work that we're doing with government at the moment is on the sort of thresholds that will be set. And those thresholds are tied to a number of different elements and components, including user numbers and functionality. And depending upon where different services sit in terms of their categorisation, additional duties will apply. In terms of the conversation today around transparency reporting, the important thing to note is that it applies to all three of the different categories. So regardless of where the thresholds sit, categorised services across the piece will be required to meet the transparency reporting requirements. And I'm going to stop there and hand over to Chloe now, I think.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And if we could go on to the next slide, Rami, thank you very much. So my name is Chloe Colliver. I am a principal in the online safety policy development team here, leading on our transparency reporting work, as well as our categorisation work and researcher access to data programme. So the next section I'm going to run through today for the presentation focuses on what is a central component of the transparency regime, and that's the transparency notices themselves. So the notices that outline what services will have to do to comply with their duties each year. So we'll talk a bit about the cycle for issuing them to service providers, as well as how Ofcom will decide what they include. So Ramneet, next slide, please. So as Andrew's just noted, stepping back a bit, the duty to produce transparency reports is one of this range of additional duties that apply to categorised services. I'm just going to take a little bit of time to explain that process to make sure that we can then get into the weeds of what those categorised services will have to do to meet their transparency duties. Ofcom has already published its advice to government about what the thresholds for categorisation should be, and that advice is available on the website for anyone who hasn't yet seen it or had a chance to read it. The stage of the process we are currently at is that the government is considering our advice and will make a decision about what the thresholds for categorisation should be. The government will then lay secondary legislation to formalise those thresholds through Parliament. Finally, once that's all happened, Ofcom will designate relevant services into one of those 3 categories. So categories 1 and 2B are for user-to-user services, and category 2A is for search for combined services. And we'll publish a list of services that meet those thresholds and conduct regular assessments to make sure that list is up to date and republish it as necessary. As Andrew mentioned, we can't really say more about the specific timelines of that process at the moment as we're awaiting government's decisions, but we will be working as quickly as possible to, once secondary legislation has passed, to make the relevant assessments and to publish that list of categorised services. So all that said, once we have the register of categorised services published, the transparency regime can begin in earnest. And as we see on the slide here, the transparency regime works largely on an annual periodic cycle. So what happens is once a year, Ofcom must issue each provider of a categorised service with a transparency notice. That notice requires them to produce a transparency report about their service by the date specified in the notice. And that cycle repeats on an annual basis. So next slide, please, Ramneet. So what will be included in a transparency notice? First, a notice sent from Ofcom to a provider will set out the information that that provider must publish in their transparency report. It will also detail the format that that information should take and the date that the report needs to be submitted to Ofcom by and published by. It's the duty of providers to make sure that their reports are published in line with what's set out in the transparency notice and to ensure that the information that they publish is complete and is accurate in all material respects. Next slide, please, Ramneet. One of the biggest parts here is thinking about what information requirements might be included in transparency notices. Ofcom has a broad remit, really, in terms of the information we can ask services to publish in their transparency reports. There's a schedule in the Act, Schedule 8, which contains a list of matters relating to online safety. And those matters are the things that we can require information about in transparency reports. It covers a wide variety of topics relating to online safety, including services, systems and processes, the design or operation of services, or their user base or functionalities. It's broken down into the matters that we can ask about for user-to-user services and those we can ask about for search services. And on this slide, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more, firstly, about the matters relating to user services. So this is relevant to the information we might be able to ask for providers of category 1 or category 2B services. So those are the user-to-user services. We've included a couple of examples here of what is in that set of matters in the Act on the slide, but the Act has a longer list. So please do refer to the full Online Safety Act, Schedule 8, if you'd like to see the full list of matters that are relevant here. But just to give you an illustrative example of what this might feel like in practice, I'll pick one of these 4 examples to go into a bit more detail. So here we've got a matter that is about the incidence of illegal content or content that is harmful to children. And taking this as an example and taking it a step further to give you a bit of an idea of what that might look like or how that might play out in practice. In existing voluntary transparency reports, a number of services report metrics relating to the incidence or prevalence or volume of content that violates specific terms of service. So this is kind of akin to or parallel to that kind of information. And that sort of information can be helpful to build a picture of the availability of that type of content that has been identified on a service. So moving on to the next slide now, thanks Ramneet. So this slide is focused on search services. So the second part of Schedule 8 in the Act lists out the matters about the information we can require of category 2A services. So thinking here about search service providers. Again, we've included some examples here on the slide to give you a bit of a sense of what those matters cover. but there are many more listed out in the legislation itself. Again, taking an example to give a bit more illustrative sense of what this might look like, we can require information about the functionalities that search providers have in place that help users manage risks of search content that is harmful to children. So if we're going to take that a little bit further and think about what it might look like or feel like in practice, we could ask about the measures that search providers have in place to identify or to manage risks of content that is harmful to children, including of a really specific type. So an example here might be the risks of content that promotes self-harm or suicide. It could include information about safety settings for children or about tools that allow users to have control over the search results that children might see. So quite a range of potential information that's listed here in the Matters for Search services. Thanks. Next slide, Ramneet. So we'll move on now to talk a little bit more about the decision-making process that Ofcom will use when we decide what a service's transparency report should include. So that means that how we design the transparency notices. Before we dig into the details, it's worth pointing out that the 4 strategic aims that Andrew outlined at the top of this presentation, they will always be the guiding light for the decisions that we make about the information that we think it's important and meaningful for services to publish. But as you noted, these are quite broad and long-term aims, so there's a need for us to have a robust process for narrowing the kinds of information requirements that we give to each service year on year in transparency notices. So that's what I'm going to talk through now. Our approach to thinking about the range of things we can ask services to report in their transparency reports is going to be guided by key principles. And in our draft guidance that we're consulting on, we set out these key principles that we think will be important building blocks for the effective use of our transparency powers. So our approach in determining what information is going to be included in transparency reports is based on key principles of relevance, appropriateness, and proportionality. So firstly, we're going to use these principles to make sure the information we request in notices is particularly relevant to the service in question, that it's appropriate to ask for in the circumstances, and as with all our work, we will look to act proportionately when making decisions. So considering what information is necessary to help us meet our aims, but also having regard to the different challenges that providers might face when they are producing and publishing information. The application of these key principles is going to help us to tailor the information that we require for individual services. So what this means is that not every transparency notice will look exactly the same. These principles will result in transparency notices that are, when needed, specific to an individual service and how it operates in practice. So we'll dig into this in a little more detail now. Next slide, please, Ramneet. So in ensuring that the information we require is relevant, that it's appropriate, that it's proportionate to ask for, we need to consider a series of factors. Some of these factors are outlined in the Act, and those that you'll see on the slide here are all outlined in the Act as factors that we need to consider when deciding what information to put in transparency notices. We won't be placing more or less weight in total on any of these factors. We'll be looking at them holistically when we're making our decisions about what information to require. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail now on exactly how we'll consider some of these factors to make sure that we're being relevant, appropriate, and proportionate in our transparency notices. So next slide, please, Ramneet. Before I jump in, I'll say that more information about all of these factors can be found in the draft guidance. So I'll talk through a little bit of that now, but there is much more detail in the consultation itself that you can refer to if you need to. The first thing to say here is quite a number of these factors relate to the risks that a service might generate. For example, the kind of service that it is, its specific functionalities, and the number of users it has, they can each affect the potential risks on a service. So these factors will help us to narrow the topics of information we might request from a service based on how we understand the risks that are most relevant to that type of service and how it works in practice. So to summarize that section, really, it's about prioritizing information about relevant risks rather than asking services about all possible risks covered by the Act. Another factor listed here is the duties that a specific service provider has to comply with under the Act. So some services will be required to comply with different duties to others. For example, a Category 1 service will have additional duties that it's responsible for complying with compared to a Category 2B service. So in certain cases, to make sure that our information requirements are appropriate, we'll need to bear in mind what duties that service has to comply with to make sure only relevant and appropriate information is required in their transparency reports. And finally, when considering the capacity of a provider, we're primarily, though not exclusively, interested in the financial resources and the level of technical expertise available. While we will seek to act proportionally when making all our decisions about the content of notices, we do also expect providers to make sure they have the resources necessary at their disposal to fulfill their transparency duties in a timely fashion. So as I mentioned, these factors are discussed further in the guidance itself. Just to demonstrate, I suppose, a little bit more about how this could work in practice, as this is quite abstract, I'll talk through a couple of examples that illustrate how we might take these factors into account when we decide what to include in transparency notices. So reflecting first on the kind of service. The Online Safety Act applies to many types of online service, potentially including social media platforms, messaging services, file sharing services, and many more. So we will consider what kind of service a service is when we design its transparency notice, particularly thinking about the specific risks that might occur because of the type of service it is. If we look at some of the evidence that Ofcom has published and produced already in our illegal safety duties materials, our risk profiles that we've published consider messaging services to be a risk factor for a specific set of high severity harms like CSEA, grooming and terrorism. And that's identified as something that's relating to the specific nature of messaging services and the functions they provide. So in that illustrative example, we would look to prioritise information about those kinds of harms in the transparency notices we give to messaging services as a priority over other types of harms that may be less relevant to that type of service. So that's the kind of way in which we might consider these factors and how they might affect the information that would be required for reporting in transparency reports. A quick second example, so thinking about the proportion of users that are children. This information might affect how we tailor notices. So where a service has children on it, we would always consider asking for information that is about the specific protections that a provider has in place for children. And where a service has a lot of children on its service, a higher proportion of the information we require is likely to be focused on the protections for children specifically. Next slide. Thanks, Ramneet. Beyond those factors that are set out in the Act that I've just run through, Ofcom has presented two other factors in our draft guidance that will affect what we include in our transparency notices. First, we'll take account of the information that service providers might have already published or provided to Ofcom. So that might include information that has been published in voluntary transparency reports or other mandatory transparency reports or in other formats elsewhere. And where that information is already available, we might seek to avoid duplicating those requirements, and we might specifically consider if there are more specific breakdowns of that existing information that would be useful for the Online Safety Act's purposes. The second factor we will consider is how we can best use our transparency powers to reveal patterns or trends from service providers. So to do this, we'll have to make decisions about information that we think it's useful to be reported over time, and also information that might be useful to understand across the industry. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail on this in the next slide. Thanks. So as I mentioned, there's two components to this factor. There's our ability to analyse information and trends over time, and the second about analysing information comparably across the industry. I'll start with thinking about the factor of time. So in thinking about how we can best assess change over time, we will consider whether a service should report certain information on a recurring basis. That's what in our guidance we're calling core information. So information we require a service to report consistently over time, year on year in transparency reports. Sometimes analysis over time is not going to be helpful nor feasible. So when it's not, we'll be requiring services to report information only once or on an ad hoc or limited basis. So we're calling that thematic information. Moving now to think about the comparability across industry. In thinking about how we can best assess comparisons across the industry, we will need to carefully decide if and when information could be reported in a similar way across multiple services, or whether that information really needs to be bespoke to each service or type of service. So when we're deciding what goes into a transparency notice each year, we'll have to consider if it's possible to require information that produces sort of comparable insights across the industry, or whether information requirements are going to need to be bespoke to remain appropriate and relevant. So overall, each services notice might end up including some core requirements, those that are requested year on year, and some thematic requirements specific to that point in time. And there might also be some elements of the notice that are the same as other services, comparable information, but also some that are bespoke and tailored to the service itself. Thanks, Romney. I won't spend too much time on this, and as with everything else in the webinar today, there is more detail on this in the draft guidance you can find on the website. But this slide shows some illustrative examples of some of the information that could be requested under each grouping. I'll just pick out two examples here. So in the top left-hand box here, this is an example of information that it might be useful for services to report over time, and then it might be possible for different services to report, so across the industry. And that example is standardized metrics that measure the prevalence, incidence, or volume of harmful or illegal content on that service. The second example I'll pull out is in the bottom right-hand corner, so the opposite effect. So information that there is not necessarily a benefit in collecting over time, and that probably needs to be tailored specifically to individual services. And an example here would be informational data that measures the way a platform has responded to a specific safety incident. So that might be driven by external factors, for example. Thanks. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my section today. Another important component of how we're going to approach our transparency reporting regime is the nature of engagement we have with services throughout this process. So I'm going to hand over to Jess, who will talk through our plans for engagement.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Hi, my name is Jessica Marcus. I'm a policy manager in the online safety policy team at Ofcom, and I lead the day-to-day work of our transparency policy workstream. So these next few slides discuss how Ofcom will engage with providers during each transparency reporting cycle. I will then discuss our plans for Ofcom's transparency reports and how we plan to use the information in providers' reports in our own reports. Can we go to the next slide, please? So Ofcom will seek to engage with providers during each transparency reporting cycle. The main reason for this will be to inform decisions about information requirements and improve providers' understanding of the transparency reporting regime. Taking a similar approach to what we have done with the video sharing platform regime, we plan to issue a draft transparency notice to each provider, which will allow them the opportunity to make representations before we issue a final notice. We may also offer some in-person meetings to providers that have been newly categorised to ensure that they understand the full scope of their duties. In the cases where Ofcom doesn't know enough about how a particular service operates, we may consider additional kinds of engagement, and this would be on a case-by-case basis to inform decisions about generally the contents of our notices. Can we go to the next slide, please? So there are three main phases to our notice process. We have the draft notice phase, the representation phase, and the final notice. Once the final notice has been issued, providers must produce the information in their reports. And I'm going to break these down in more detail over the next few slides. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so in step one of the notice process, so once the register of categorised services has been published or updated, Ofcom shares a draft notice to each provider. We may choose to stagger our notices, which would mean that the timings may differ between reporting periods. Each draft notice sets out the information that is required from services, the format the service provider is required to publish the report in, and the date by which the platform should submit their report to Ofcom and publish their report, which will be on the same day. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in step two, so once providers have received a draft notice, they will be able to make written representations on the draft notice and raise any concerns that they might have about producing the information that we are requiring. So providers may wish to ask Ofcom for clarifications about the information, discuss timings, or raise any concerns that they may have about producing the information. We'll typically acknowledge the receipt of the draft representations and engage via calls or emails if necessary about some of the representations that they've made. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, step three of the notice process, this is where we issue the actual formal notice. And we'll only be issuing our formal notices once the representation process is complete. So once the formal notice has been issued, we wouldn't expect to engage further with providers about the transparency notice. So the point is that ideally, any issues should have been hopefully resolved during that representation phase. Next slide, please. So that was generally our approach to engagement. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we plan to use information in providers' transparency reports to inform Ofcom's own transparency reports. So going to the next slide, thank you. As per the Act, once a year, Ofcom must publish its own transparency report. This will include a summary of conclusions drawn from provider transparency reports about any patterns or trends which we have identified, along with a summary of measures which we consider to be good practice. And while provider transparency reports will typically offer insight into how individual services address risks and mitigate harms on their services, Ofcom's transparency reports will contextualize those findings, so drawing out points of comparison between services and highlighting examples of best or poor practice for the wider industry. Our sort of, general ambitions for Ofcom's transparency reports are to encourage services to improve their safety systems and processes, learning from practices across wider industry, and to empower UK citizens with relevant and accurate information about risks and safety outcomes on services so they can take informed decisions about how to live their lives online. Can you go to the next slide, please? So to achieve these ambitions, we'll be focusing on three main areas when preparing our reports. These are converting data into insight, seeking comparability, and shining a light on best practice. So starting with converting data into insights, Ofcom's reports will aim to translate technical information in provider reports into accessible insights for users. So we will look at the reported data and highlight its implications in a way which is useful for users. We will also seek to compare findings across reports where applicable to identify those patterns and trends. By doing this, we're hoping that this will encourage services to pursue self-improvements and demonstrate leadership around good safety practice on certain issues and areas. The types of information published by services, such as core and thematic information, which Chloe spoke about earlier, will affect our approach to also presenting and communicating our conclusions in Ofcom's reports. So where information is comparable over time and or across services, we can then focus on identifying and presenting patterns and trends in our reports. And then where information is not standardized in this way, so this might be the thematic information, we can present individual insights and seek to place them in the relevant context. So some examples of how we might seek to make comparisons kind of within and between services in our reports could include comparing how individual services are performing over time, so focusing on specific metrics or qualitative information, and providing commentary on the implications of those changes or lack of from one period to the next. This would enable us to identify benchmarks for good practice that are kind of specific and relevant to the service in question. So an example of this could be we may monitor harm reduction metrics or changes to staffing. And then these comparisons would enable us to review service-specific context, considering the drivers of those changes and their implications sort of both relative to the size of the services and also the level of risk to users. And then we may also seek to compare sort of a metric or a piece of information that has been reported across multiple services. So sort of any comparative analysis over time or between services would take into account sort of the differences in how individual services report information, including any sort of variations in definitions and data collection methodologies. And then finally, to achieve our aim of shining a light on best practice and gaps in industry efforts, we would seek to identify examples of good practice and highlight the sort of different approaches services can take to address various issues related to online safety and both the sort of benefits and limitations of those approaches. So by doing this, we would hope to sort of support services across the industry, including both those kind of small and newly created services, to be able to kind of learn from the experiences of other companies. And in our analysis would also seek to identify any gaps or deficiencies in industry or services efforts to protect users. We think that, we hope that with Ofcom's own report set will be a somewhat iterative process. So once published, we would look to engage potentially with expert organisations to ensure that our reporting is being, properly understood and taking on board any improvements we can take forward for future reporting and making sure that it's kind of sort of landing and having the impact that we hope. Can we go to the next slide, please? So while Ofcom will primarily use information from provider transparency reports to inform its own reports, we are also able to draw on information from other sources. So this could include trends, insights, or data from third parties such as academics, independent research organisations, and also Ofcom's own research. We can also draw on information obtained through formal and informal information gathered from providers, including through our statutory powers to issue information notices and through broader engagement with stakeholders. And where such information has been gathered for a different purpose, we will engage with providers on this. And I will also draw people's attention to the fact that our guidance on information notices was published on the same day as our transparency guidance. So if you want more information about our information notices powers, I'd also recommend you read that guidance as well. Could we go to the next slide? So for the final part of this, and we only have very few slides left, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the expected impact of our transparency regime and also generally how to engage with this consultation. So can you go to the next slide, please? So we believe the impact of transparency reporting can be sort of extensive and really far-reaching. Transparency reporting can encourage services to improve their safety practices in a way that results in better safety outcomes for UK users on their service. And transparency reporting can also increase users' understanding of regulated services, enabling them to make informed choices about how they spend their time online. So that's the impact that we're trying to achieve. And everything we're doing here is sort of pointing towards making those kinds of impacts. Next slide, please. And then finally, sort of we really strongly welcome input on the consultation. We're super keen to hear your views on our approach. And to practically engage with our consultation, please visit our consultation page on our website. Our consultation closes on the 4th of October, so please send any responses to our email. It's ostransparency@ofcom.org.uk. This information can all be found at the end of our consultation document. You can also scan the QR code or follow the link on the slide, which will lead you straight to the page. But yeah, thank you so much for joining today and listening to our presentation.